The evening was colder than usual on the wide, empty plains. The sky was painted in shades of dying orange, slowly swallowed by deep gray clouds. The wind carried a bitter chill, bending the tall grass like waves in a restless sea. Far in the distance, the lonely cry of a coyote echoed, reminding anyone listening that this land belonged more to silence than to people. Dust clung to the boots of the rancher as his horse moved steadily along the dirt path. He pulled his coat tighter against his chest, his breath rising in pale clouds. It was the kind of night where even the stars seemed hesitant to shine, where something unseen lingered in the shadows, waiting to be found. The rancher urged his horse forward, the steady clop of hooves the only sound breaking the cold silence of the plains. His mind was on the fire he hoped to build at home, the warmth he longed for after a long day's ride. But then, faintly carried by the wind, he heard something unusual, a sound that didn't belong to the night. At first, he thought it was the cry of an animal, maybe a fox or a wounded bird. Yet as he slowed his horse, the sound grew clearer. It was softer, trembling, filled with fear. A child's voice. His eyes narrowed toward the silhouette of an abandoned barn, its roof sagging, its wooden walls leaning with age. The cries came from there, echoing in broken waves, each one pulling at his chest. He tightened his grip on the reins. Whatever was inside that barn wasn't meant to be alone in the dark. Through the cracks in the barn's broken wall, the rancher saw a flicker of movement. Two small figures huddled in the corner, their faces pale in the moonlight that leaked through the broken roof. One was older, quiet, clutching her sister's hand tightly. The other, a little girl, no more than 8, was trembling, her voice breaking like glass. Tears streaked her dirt-stained cheeks as she looked up at the shadow of a man towering over them. Her words came out in desperate sobs, each one sharper than a knife. "Take her instead of me." The rancher froze. His chest tightened as those words echoed inside him, words no child should ever have to speak. It wasn't just fear in her voice, it was sacrifice. In that instant, he knew this was no ordinary encounter. Something cruel had forced this child to believe her only way to save her sister was to offer herself. The rancher's breath caught as the words echoed in the hollow barn. "Take her instead of me." The plea hung in the cold air, heavy and unnatural. Who was this child talking to? Why would someone so young believe she had to trade her life for another? His pulse quickened, each beat louder than the creak of the wooden beams above. Shadows shifted in the barn's corners, and for a moment he could not tell if the girl was facing a man, a monster, or only the ghosts of her own fear. The older sister's silence made it worse, her eyes wide, her lips pressed shut, as if she already knew the cost of speaking. Questions twisted through the rancher's mind like thorns. Who hunted these children? What cruel fate taught them such words? He stayed hidden in the dark, but every second of silence deepened the mystery, pressing him closer to the truth waiting inside. The rancher was not a man strangers noticed twice. His face carried lines carved too early by grief, and his eyes, once bright, had grown heavy with shadows. Years ago, he had returned from war, but the battlefield had followed him home, haunting his nights with screams and fire. Worse than the war, though, was the silence of his empty house. His wife, gone to fever. His only son, taken by the same cruel sickness. Since then, the ranch had been nothing more than work and dust, a place to hide rather than to live. He spoke little, trusted less, and carried his pain the way he carried his scars, quietly, beneath layers of worn leather and tired skin. To the townsfolk, he was just another man with a broken past. But inside, he was a storm, waiting for something, or someone, to remind him that life could still hold meaning. Anna was only 8, yet her small frame looked even younger, almost fragile against the shadows of the barn. Her arms were thin, her dress torn at the edges, and her bare feet were covered in dust. Fear lived in her wide eyes, but there was also something stronger, a desperate courage far too heavy for a child to carry. Every tremble of her lips told a story of hunger, cold nights, and the kind of loss that steals childhood away too soon. When she spoke, her voice wavered like a candle flame in the wind, but her words carried a strange weight, as if she had learned sacrifice before she ever learned safety. She clung to her sister's hand with all her strength, yet even in her fear she was willing to let go if it meant saving the one she loved most. Clara stood close beside her younger sister, her hand wrapped tightly around Anna's as though it were the only anchor left in a world that wanted to tear them apart. At 14, she carried herself with a quiet strength that did not match her years. Her eyes, sharp and watchful, scanned every corner of the barn, not with fear, but with a hardened caution learned too early. The weight of responsibility had stolen her softness. Where laughter should have been, silence had taken root. Her shoulders were thin, but they bore the burden of 2 lives. While Anna trembled and cried, Clara's lips pressed into a line of iron, as if she had promised herself she would never show weakness again. She was still a child, but in that dim light, she looked more like a mother, a protector, ready to break before she allowed anyone to break her sister. The rancher pushed the barn door open just enough to slip inside, his boots silent on the dusty floorboards. The cries had stopped, but the silence was heavier now, thick with fear. In the far corner, beneath broken beams and drifting straw, he saw them. 2 girls pressed close together, their faces pale in the moonlight. Anna's small body shook with every breath, while Clara's arms stretched protectively across her, as if her thin frame could shield them both. The rancher's gaze lifted, and then he saw why they were hiding. Shadows moved just outside the barn, the low murmur of men's voices cutting through the wind. Their tone was rough, filled with menace, the kind of voices that hunted, not helped. In that moment, the truth struck him hard. These children weren't lost. They were being hunted. And if he left them here, the night would swallow them whole. Anna's voice trembled in the dark, but her words cut sharper than any blade. She slipped from her sister's arms and stepped forward on shaking legs, her small figure barely visible against the broken light. "Take me," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the shadows outside. "Take me instead of her." Clara gasped and tried to pull her back, but Anna resisted, pressing her tiny hands against her sister's chest, as if to push her into safety. The rancher froze, his breath catching as the weight of the moment sank in. No child should know such sacrifice. Yet here stood this little girl, ready to give herself up so her sister might live. For a man who had lost his own child, the sight was like an old wound torn open. His heart ached, his fists clenched, and in that instant he knew he could not simply watch. He would not allow a child's love to end in tragedy. The rancher stepped out of the shadows at last, his figure tall and steady in the faint glow of moonlight. The girls flinched, thinking another danger had found them, but his voice broke the tension, low, firm, and certain. "No one's taking either of you." His hand stretched out, not demanding but offering. Anna stared at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, torn between fear and the faint spark of hope. Clara tightened her grip on her sister, unsure whether to trust this stranger. Outside, the men's voices grew louder, closer. Time was running thin. The rancher's jaw hardened as he made his choice. He lifted Anna into one arm, guided Clara close with the other, and carried them out the back of the barn, away from the footsteps that sought them. His horse stood waiting, its breath fogging in the cold night air. Without hesitation, he placed both girls on the saddle, swung up behind them, and whispered, "You're safe now. I'll take you both." In that instant, the lonely rancher became something more. A shield, a promise, a lifeline. As the horse galloped into the night, The barn shrinking into the darkness behind them, the rancher's mind spun with questions. The girls clung to him, their small bodies trembling against his coat, but neither spoke a word. He could feel Clara's sharp, guarded breaths, and Anna's soft sobs pressed into his chest. Who were those men stalking them through the plains? Why would they hunt children with such determination? And what kind of life had forced an 8-year-old to offer herself in place of her sister? The rancher tightened his hold on the reins, his heart pounding harder than the horse's hooves. Whatever secret these sisters carried, it was one powerful enough to make grown men dangerous. And he knew, saving them tonight was only the beginning. By the time the rancher reached his homestead, the night had swallowed the plains in silence. The small wooden house stood alone against the endless dark, its windows dim, its porch weathered by years of storms. He swung down from the saddle, steadying the girls as they slid nervously to the ground. The air smelled of smoke from the chimney he had left cold all day, waiting for his return. When he opened the door, the house felt even emptier than usual. Bare walls, a quiet hearth, a table set for no one. Yet, as the girls stepped inside, clutching each other's hands, the silence seemed to change. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but of something uncertain, something fragile, like the pause before a prayer. The rancher lit the lamp, its golden glow spreading warmth across the room, and for the first time in years, his house did not feel quite so hollow. The girls stood just inside the doorway, their eyes darting around the dimly lit room as if every shadow might still hide danger. Clara kept Anna close, her arm wrapped protectively around her, while Anna's small stomach growled loud enough to break the silence. The rancher noticed but said nothing at first. He moved to the cupboard, pulled out a half loaf of bread and a small pot of beans, and set them gently on the table. The smell filled the room, and Anna's eyes widened, but she did not move. Clara's lips tightened, suspicion written across her young face, as though kindness itself had become something unfamiliar. Only when the rancher stepped back, leaving the food untouched before them, did Clara guide her sister forward. Their hands shook as they tore into the bread, each bite quick, desperate, yet cautious, like strays who had forgotten what safety felt like. At first, the girls ate in silence, their eyes flicking to the rancher with every movement he made, as if one wrong step might turn him into another enemy. But as the minutes passed, the warmth of the lamp and the steady crackle of the fire softened the edges of their fear. Anna, her mouth still full of bread, glanced up at him with hesitant curiosity, while Clara studied him with a seriousness far beyond her years. The rancher did not press them with questions, nor did he crowd their space. He simply sat nearby, mending a worn leather strap with quiet patience. That simple act, that silence, without demand, seemed to ease something unspoken between them. When Anna finally whispered a shy, "Thank you," and Clara allowed her shoulders to relax, the rancher knew a fragile thread had been tied between them, a thread of trust, thin but real, the beginning of something neither side had expected to find. The truth came slowly, not in full confessions, but in the way the girls carried their silence. One evening, as the fire glowed low and the wind rattled the shutters, Anna clutched the hem of her dress and whispered about her mother's lullabies, how they had stopped too soon. Clara's eyes hardened at the mention, her jaw tightening before she quickly changed the subject. Later, when the rancher asked gently if someone would be looking for them, Clara shook her head, her voice steady but soft. "There's no one left." It was not said with tears, but with the heavy certainty of a child who had learned grief without comfort. The rancher felt the words sink into him like cold iron. He recognized the look in their eyes, the same hollow ache he saw in the mirror every morning. These children, like him, had been left behind by the ones they needed most. Bit by bit, the story unraveled in broken pieces, like threads pulled loose from an old cloth. Clara never spoke directly of it, but her guarded words painted the picture clear enough. Their father had fallen into debt, desperate, reckless, and when he could not pay, the men who held the debt came to collect something else. They claimed the sisters as payment, as if lives could be tallied like coins. Anna, too young to understand the full cruelty, only knew those men had reached for her sister first, and that was why she had begged to be taken instead. Clara's silence spoke louder than words. The bitterness in her eyes told of nights spent running, hiding, listening for footsteps that never seemed far enough away. To the rancher, it was more than injustice. It was evil dressed in flesh. And as he listened, something hard and unyielding began to settle in his chest. The question weighed on the rancher long after the girls had gone to sleep in the small loft above his kitchen. Why would a child so young, so fragile, believe that the only way to protect her sister was to give herself away? He thought of the tremble in Anna's voice, the way her small hands had pushed Clara behind her, and it gnawed at him like a thorn buried deep. Children were meant to run, to laugh, to dream, but Anna had learned sacrifice before she had learned safety. Somewhere in her short life, someone had taught her that her worth was not in living, but in being offered up. The thought made the rancher's chest ache, reopening the scars of his own past. He could not shake the mystery, nor the cruel truth behind it. No child should ever believe that love is proven only by losing themselves. The rancher carried his grief like an invisible brand, etched deeper with every passing year. Once his home had been filled with laughter, the sound of his wife humming as she worked by the fire, the quick footsteps of a little boy chasing shadows across the floor. But fever had come one winter, swift and merciless. First, his wife's warmth faded from the bed. Then his son's laughter fell silent, leaving the house hollow and cruelly still. He had buried them both on the hill overlooking the plains, marked only by two weathered crosses that bent against the wind. Since then, the ranch had become less a home and more a place of exile, a prison built from memories he could not outrun. He spoke little, trusted even less, and each night returned to a house that echoed only with ghosts. That loss had carved him into a man of silence. And yet seeing Anna and Clara, fragile but unbroken, stirred something long buried in him, a reminder of what he had lost and what he might still protect. Every time the rancher looked at the sisters, pieces of his old life stirred painfully within him. Anna's small hands reminded him of the little fingers that once clutched his own, and Clara's quiet, watchful eyes mirrored the same protective gaze his wife had worn when shielding their boy from storms. At night, when he heard Anna's soft whimpers in her sleep, it pulled him back to the sound of his son crying through fevered nights, cries he could not soothe, no matter how tightly he held him. The echoes of the past pressed against the present, blurring what was gone with what stood before him. It hurt to see them, hurt to feel warmth again in a house he had long accepted as cold. And yet, beneath the ache, there was something else rising, something he was almost afraid to name, the fragile spark of belonging, daring to return after years of silence. The rancher sat alone on the porch one night, a lantern flickering at his side, while the sisters slept in the loft above. His eyes drifted toward the dark horizon, but his mind was torn inward. A voice inside warned him not to grow attached, not to reopen the wounds he had spent years trying to seal. Protecting them meant danger, danger from the men who hunted them, danger of losing them like he had lost his own. Could his heart survive another burial, another empty chair at the table? Yet another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered that walking away would be a far greater cowardice. He thought of Anna's trembling sacrifice, of Clara's fierce silence, of the weight they carried that no children should bear. He clenched his fists against his knees, torn between fear and duty. The war inside him was simple but merciless. Protect them and risk everything, or turn away and lose the last chance to heal his broken soul. By the end of the week, whispers began to spread through the dusty streets of the nearby town. Strangers had ridden in, hard-eyed men with scarred faces and cruel mouths, their boots heavy on the wooden boards outside the saloon. They asked questions at the general store, left coins on the counter of the tavern, and leaned too close when speaking to townsfolk. "Two girls," they said in low voices. "One small, one older. Seen 'em?" Their horses stood restless outside, their saddlebags marked with the stains of long travel. People avoided their gaze, but fear traveled quicker than silence, and soon the whole town knew trouble had arrived. Some swore the men carried papers, claiming ownership of the children, as if that made their hunt lawful. Others whispered darker things, that those men had no interest in justice, only control. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: they would not leave until they found the sisters. The rancher heard it first in the murmur of old men outside the blacksmith's shop, then again in the hushed voices of women at the well. Nobody spoke it loud, but the words carried a weight heavier than gunmetal. "They'll never stop until they claim what's theirs." The townsfolk lowered their eyes when the strangers passed, pretending not to see, yet everyone felt the unease settle like dust in their lungs. Some pitied the girls they had not even met. Others simply feared becoming targets themselves. To them, the men were not hunters to be defied, but storms to be endured. And as the whispers spread, the rancher felt a familiar anger burn in his chest. These people had already accepted the girl's fate as if it were written, as if children could belong to monsters because of another man's debt. The words echoed in him like a challenge, daring him to prove them wrong. Back at the ranch, the air no longer felt safe. Every creak of the windmill, every crunch of gravel under a stray hoof, made the rancher's hand twitch toward the rifle resting by the door. He had hoped bringing the girls home had ended their nightmare, but the whispers in town told him otherwise. Those men were close now, closer than the girls knew, and they would not leave without blood or victory. As he watched Anna chase the barn cat in the yard, and Clara quietly fetching water with her guarded eyes, he felt the weight of the truth press against him. The storm had only just begun. He had saved them once, but if he was not ready, he might not be able to save them again. The neighbor, a broad man named Harlan, rode up to the ranch one evening with a smile too wide to be trusted. He brought a sack of flour and a jug of milk, claiming he thought the girls might need a little kindness. The rancher accepted it with a nod, though his eyes lingered on Harlan's shifting gaze. Inside, Clara watched silently from the window, her instincts sharp, while Anna clung to her sleeve. Harlan spoke kindly, asking harmless questions: how the girls were adjusting, whether they'd be staying long, if the rancher planned to take them into town. His words dripped like honey, but his eyes told another story: restless, greedy, measuring. That night, when the rancher returned from checking his fences, he noticed fresh hoofprints leading away from the property, deeper than his own horse's tracks. By morning, the strangers would know exactly where to find the sisters. And though the girls slept peacefully in the loft, danger was already galloping toward them. When the rancher discovered the hoofprints and pieced together Harlan's false kindness, his chest tightened with fury. He had opened his door to a neighbor, and in doing so, he had unknowingly placed the girls in greater danger. That evening, Clara noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hand never left the rifle by the door. Anna, sensing the unease, whispered if they had done something wrong. The rancher shook his head, but the hurt in their eyes told him the damage was already done. Trust had been fragile, like glass balancing on a ledge, and now it was cracked. Clara's guarded silence returned, her gaze sharp with suspicion, and Anna clung to her sister more tightly than before. The betrayal didn't just threaten their safety, it pulled them backward into the fear they had only begun to escape. The house, once warming with fragile hope, grew cold again under the shadow of treachery. It was deep in the night when the first sound broke through the quiet. Hoofbeats, heavy and deliberate, circling the ranch like wolves testing a fence. The rancher's eyes snapped open and his hand went instantly to the rifle leaning by the door. Outside, lanterns flickered in the dark, their glow cutting through the fields like hungry eyes. The low murmur of voices followed, rough and certain, men who knew exactly where they had come. Inside, Clara stirred first, her instincts sharper than sleep. She pressed Anna close, her breath shallow as if she could make them both disappear in silence. The rancher moved with slow precision, checking every window, every shadow. He had feared this night since the moment he found the girls in that broken barn. Now, it was here. The danger he had tried to keep away had found his doorstep, and it would not leave without a fight. The first fist slammed against the wooden door, rattling the hinges, followed by the harsh command, "Send the girls out!" The rancher's jaw tightened as he raised his rifle, his body braced like stone. He motioned Clara and Anna toward the back corner, his voice low but steady. "Stay down. Don't move." The men outside began to circle, boots crunching against gravel, testing the windows, shouting threats that tore through the night. Then came the crack of splintering wood as one tried to force his way inside. The rancher fired, the blast echoing across the plains, sending the intruder stumbling back into the dark. For a moment, silence followed. Then chaos erupted. Bullets tore into the house. Glass shattered, dust filled the air. Still, the rancher stood firm, returning fire, his body a shield between the children and the storm raging outside. Every pull of the trigger was not just defense. It was a vow that no one would take them while he still drew breath. While Anna buried her face against the wall, trembling with every gunshot, Clara rose from her crouch, her jaw set tight with a fire that fear could not smother. She refused to stay hidden while the rancher fought alone. Ignoring his urgent gesture to get back, she grabbed a small iron poker from beside the hearth and stood near the doorway, her thin frame outlined by the flickering firelight. Her hands shook, but her eyes did not, steady, sharp, unblinking. When a shadow pressed against the broken window, Clara swung the poker with all the strength her young arms could muster, shattering the glass and driving the intruder back into the dark. She did not cry out, did not falter. For a brief moment, the rancher caught sight of her and felt a surge of awe. This was not a frightened child anymore. Clara had become steel, willing to stand beside him in the fire, no matter the cost. Amid the chaos, the gunfire, the shouts, the crash of glass, Anna scrambled from her hiding place and threw herself against the rancher's side. Her small arms clung desperately to his waist, her fingers digging into his coat as if letting go would mean losing everything. Tears streaked her dirt-stained cheeks, and through sobs she choked the same words again and again. "Take her instead of me. Take her instead of me." Her voice, high and trembling, cut deeper than the bullets flying past. The rancher felt her shaking body pressed against him, and the weight of those words made his chest ache like an old wound reopening. She wasn't only afraid, she believed it was the only way to save her sister. For a man who had buried his own child, hearing such sacrifice from one so young was unbearable. He tightened his arm around her, shielding her small frame with his own body, and in that moment he swore silently that neither of them would be given up. Not now, not ever. The fight raged longer than the rancher had hoped. He moved from window to doorway, firing into the dark, each shot driving the intruders back, but never far enough. Then, with a flash and a thunderous crack, a bullet tore through the night and found him. Pain exploded in his shoulder, spinning him back against the wall. His rifle slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor as hot blood soaked through his shirt. For a moment his vision blurred, the room spinning with smoke and shadows. Clara cried out, rushing toward him, but he barked through clenched teeth for her to stay back. The men outside, hearing his stumble, roared with renewed hunger, slamming harder against the door. The rancher pressed his hand to the wound, every heartbeat pounding like a hammer against the raw flesh. He knew he was hurt badly, but he also knew he could not fall. If he did, the girls would be lost. The door finally gave way with a thunderous crack, splinters flying as two of the men forced their way inside. Clara grabbed Anna's hand and pulled her toward the loft ladder, but one of the intruders was faster. Rough hands seized Clara's arm, yanking her back with a force that nearly tore her off her feet. Anna screamed, clawing at her sister's sleeve, only to be ripped away herself by another man who scooped her up like stolen cargo. Their cries filled the cabin, sharp and desperate, echoing off the wooden walls. Clara kicked and fought, her fingernails digging into the man's skin, while Anna thrashed helplessly, sobbing for the rancher. From the floor, bleeding and barely able to lift his arm, the rancher's vision swam with fury. He watched as the nightmare unfolded. These men were about to steal from him the very souls he had promised to protect. And in that instant, pain no longer mattered. He knew he would either rise to stop them or die trying. Time slowed as the rancher dragged himself to his knees, blood dripping from his shoulder, his breath ragged. One man was hauling Clara toward the open door, her heels scraping against the floor as she kicked and fought. Another had Anna locked in his arms, her cries piercing the night as she reached out toward him. In that desperate instant, the rancher knew he could only reach one of them with the strength he had left. His rifle lay just beyond his grasp, and the weight of choice pressed down harder than the pain of his wound. Save the older girl now, and the little one would be lost. Save Anna, and Clara would be dragged into darkness. His heart pounded, torn between the impossible, sacrifice one or risk losing both. The ache of his past came roaring back, the grave of his wife, the silence where his son should have been. He clenched his jaw, fury burning through the haze of pain. He had lost his family once. He would not choose again, not this time. With blood soaking his sleeve and pain screaming through every muscle, the rancher forced himself upright. His body trembled, his vision blurred, but something stronger than flesh carried him now. He staggered toward the fallen rifle, every step a battle, every breath a war. Clara's cries cut through the haze, Anna's desperate sobs gave him strength, and the memory of 2 wooden crosses on a lonely hill lit a fire in his chest. He would not bury another child. With a guttural roar, he snatched up the rifle, swung it to his shoulder, and fired. The first shot cracked through the cabin, tearing the grip of the man holding Clara. She stumbled free. Another blast sent Anna's captor crashing backward, releasing her into the rancher's outstretched arm. Wounded but unbroken, he stood tall, shielding them both with his body. His pain no longer mattered. What mattered was the vow burning in his heart. No one takes them while I stand. By dawn, the battle had spilled beyond the ranch and down toward the river's edge, where the morning mist coiled low over the water like a ghostly veil. The rancher, battered and bleeding, led the girls behind the rocks, his rifle clutched in hands that refused to surrender. Across the bank, the remaining pursuers spread out, their boots crunching against the frost-hardened earth, their voices echoing threats through the still air. The river glimmered faintly under the rising sun, its current swift and merciless, as if nature itself had chosen this place for a reckoning. Gunfire cracked, shattering the quiet of dawn, each shot ringing like a final demand. The rancher moved with desperate precision, using every ounce of grit left in him, his body driven not by strength, but by sheer will. Clara, crouched beside Anna, refused to look away, her eyes blazing with defiance. This was no longer a hunt. It was a war for their freedom, and it would end here by the river with the rising sun as their only witness. The gunfire echoed across the riverbank, each shot a test of endurance, each breath a battle against collapse. The pursuers pressed hard, certain they could break a wounded man. But the rancher had more than bullets. He had resolve. Using the mist as his shield, he lured them into narrow ground where their numbers meant nothing. With quick thinking, he led one man into the soft earth by the water's edge, where his heavy boots sank deep, slowing him until a single, well-placed shot ended the fight. Another charged recklessly, only to be disarmed when the rancher struck him with the butt of his rifle, sending him tumbling into the icy current. One by one, their confidence crumbled until fear replaced greed in their eyes. The rancher stood tall despite the blood soaking his side, his presence unshaken, his aim steady. At last, with the final pursuer fleeing into the trees, the riverbank grew silent again. He had not only survived, he had outwitted, outlasted, and defeated them all. Against the weight of death, his courage and cleverness had carved a path to freedom. When the dust of battle settled, the rancher steadied himself against the rocks, his rifle still warm in his hands. Clara's eyes narrowed as she caught sight of a familiar figure lingering at the tree line, Harlan, the neighbor, pretending to arrive late as though he had come to help. But his mistake was written on him. The same dust from the pursuer's trail clung to his boots, and the same coins the men had spent in town now jingled from his pocket. The rancher's gaze locked on him, cold and unflinching. "You led them here," he said, his voice low but cutting like steel. The girls stared, betrayal washing over their faces as Harlan stammered excuses, his false smile crumbling. But the truth was undeniable. He had sold innocence for silver, traded children's lives for a handful of coins. The rancher's grip tightened on the rifle, but he did not fire. Instead, he let silence condemn Harlan, forcing him to stand exposed under the weight of his own treachery. And in that silence, the girls knew who had truly stood for them, and who had abandoned them. As the riverbank quieted and the danger faded, Anna clung to the rancher's coat, her small voice breaking the silence with the words that had first torn through his soul. Through trembling lips, she whispered again, "Take her instead of me." Her eyes, wide and glistening, looked up at him with the same desperate innocence she had carried since that night in the barn. It was not just fear. It was the belief that her only worth was in sacrifice. The rancher knelt, despite the pain searing through his wound, and placed a steady hand on her trembling shoulder. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, the echoes of his own buried grief colliding with the fragile hope in her eyes. Then, with a voice rough but filled with unshakable resolve, he answered, "No. Never. I take you both. Always." His words fell heavy, not as a promise but as a vow carved into the marrow of his being. In that moment, the little girl's sacrifice turned to safety, her fear to belonging, and for the first time, Anna let herself believe she was worth saving too. The words left his lips with the weight of a lifetime behind them. "Number I take you both. Always." For the first time in years, his voice did not sound hollow. It rang with certainty, with a fierce kind of love he thought he had buried with his wife and child. Clara froze, her guarded expression cracking as tears welled in her eyes. Anna's trembling stopped, her small fingers tightening around his hand as though clinging to the promise itself. Those words were more than comfort. They were a shield, a declaration that no man, no storm, no cruel fate would ever tear them apart again. In that moment, the rancher was no longer just a lone survivor of grief. He was a father once more, a protector, a man reborn by the very lives he had chosen to defend. And for the sisters, two children who had known only loss and fear, it was the first time in a long time they believed in forever. When the last echo of danger faded into the morning mist, the sisters clung to the rancher as if letting go might pull them back into the nightmare. Clara, who had held her tears behind walls of iron, finally broke, burying her face against his chest as sobs shook through her thin frame. Anna's small hands trembled as she touched his blood-stained sleeve, afraid he might vanish if she blinked. But when his rough voice reassured them, steady, certain, unyielding, the fear in their eyes slowly melted. For the first time since their world had fallen apart, they felt the weight of safety settle around them like a warm blanket. No more running, no more hiding. The terror that had lived in their bones loosened its grip, replaced by the fragile but undeniable truth that they were no longer alone. And in the circle of the rancher's arms, they realized the words they had prayed for in silence had finally come alive. They were safe. In the weeks that followed, the once silent ranch began to breathe with new life. Where there had only been the creak of the windmill and the groan of empty floorboards, now came the sound of laughter echoing across the yard, of footsteps running up and down the porch. Anna chased chickens through the dust with a giggle that carried farther than the wind, while Clara learned to ride the old mare, her cautious strength turning slowly into confidence. The rooms that had stood hollow for years filled with small signs of belonging, Anna's drawings tucked against the wall, Clara's careful stitching left on the table, two voices whispering in the loft at night. When neighbors passed by, they no longer saw a lonely man's house on the edge of the plains. They saw a home lit by a warm fire and guarded by love. And when the sisters whispered home to one another, it was no longer a wish, it was the truth. For years, grief had been the rancher's only companion, a shadow that walked with him through empty rooms and silent fields. But now, as he watched Anna and Clara breathe life into the home he once thought cursed, the weight on his chest began to lift. The echoes of his wife's laughter and his son's footsteps no longer tore at him with cruelty. Instead, they blended with the present, soft reminders that love had not ended with loss. He found himself smiling at Anna's mischief, pausing to teach Clara the same lessons he once gave his boy, and realizing that the hollow ache inside him was slowly filling with warmth again. Grief would never leave him fully. It had carved its mark too deep, but the sharpness dulled with each passing day, replaced by something he had thought forever lost: hope. And in that fragile hope, the rancher began to live again. As the sun dipped low across the wide plains, the sky blazed with streaks of gold and crimson, painting the land in a warmth that seemed to reach straight into the heart. On the hill just beyond the ranch house, the rancher stood tall, his weathered frame steady despite the scars that still ached. Beside him, Clara held Anna's hand, their small figures pressed close against his sides. The wind tugged gently at their clothes, carrying laughter and silence together as if the earth itself had paused to honor them. They were not bound by blood, nor by law, but by something greater, the fierce choice to belong to one another. In that moment, the loneliness of the ranch was gone, replaced by a living promise. A family forged not from what was lost, but from what was found. And as the three stood together against the endless horizon, they were no longer broken pieces, but one whole, chosen by love.